Social change in development in India. Textbook in Sociology for Class 12. Forward. The National Curriculum Framework, NCF, 2005, recommends that children's life at school must be linked to their life outside the school. This principle marks a departure from the legacy of bookish learning which continues to shape our system and causes a gap between the school, home and community. The syllabi and textbooks developed on the basis of NCF signify an attempt to implement this basic idea. They also attempt to discourage rote learning and the maintenance of sharp boundaries between different subject areas. We hope these measures will take us significantly further in the direction of a child-centered system of education outlined in the National Policy on Education, 1986. The success of this effort depends on the steps that school principals and teachers will take to encourage children to reflect on their own learning and to pursue imaginative activities and questions. We must recognize that, given space, time and freedom, children generate new knowledge by engaging with the information passed on to them by adults. Treating the prescribed textbook as the sole basis of examination is one of the key reasons why other resources and sites of learning are ignored. Inculcating creativity and initiative is possible if we perceive and treat children as participants in learning, not as receivers of a fixed body of knowledge. These aims imply considerable change in school routines and mode of functioning. Flexibility in the daily timetable is as necessary as rigor in implementing the annual calendar so that the required number of teaching days are actually devoted to teaching. The methods used for teaching and evaluation will also determine how effective this textbook proves in making children's life at school a happy experience, rather than a source of stress or boredom. Syllabus designers have tried to address the problem of curricular burden by restructuring and reorienting knowledge at different stages with greater consideration for child psychology and the time available for teaching. The textbook attempts to enhance this endeavor by giving higher priority and space to opportunities for contemplation and wondering, discussion in small groups, and activities requiring hands-on experience. The National Council of Educational Research and Training, NCERT, appreciates the hard work done by the Textbook Development Committee responsible for this textbook. We wish to thank the chairperson of the Advisory Group in Social Sciences, Professor Hari Vasudevan, and the chief advisor for this textbook, Professor Yogendra Singh, for guiding the work of this committee. Several teachers contributed to the development of this textbook. We are grateful to their principals for making this possible. We are indebted to the institutions and organizations which have generously permitted us to draw upon their resources, material and personnel. We are especially grateful to the members of the National Monitoring Committee, appointed by the Department of Secondary and Higher Education, Ministry of Human Resource Development under the chairpersonship of Professor Rinal Miri and Professor G.P. Deshpande, for their valuable time and contribution. As an organization committed to systemic reform and continuous improvement in the quality of its products, NCERT welcomes comments and suggestions which will enable us to undertake further revision and refinement. Director. National Council of Educational Research and Training. New Delhi, 20 November 2006. Acknowledgements. The many debts incurred in meeting the challenge of producing this textbook under a very tight schedule are gratefully acknowledged. First of all, thanks to all the colleagues of the editorial team and members who took out time from their other commitments to devote their energies to this task. Yogendra Singh, Professor Emeritus, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and our chief advisor, was, as always, a pillar of support who gave us the confidence to proceed. He and Krishna Kumar, Professor and Director, NCERT, provided the abhay-hasta that enabled and guided our collective efforts. Savita Sinha, Professor and Head, Department of Education in Social Sciences and Humanities, lent unstinting support. Shweta Uppal, Chief Editor, NCERT, not only facilitated our work but encouraged us to aim higher. We are thankful to Seema Banerjee, PGT, Sociology, Laxman Public School, New Delhi, Dev N. Pathak, Bluebell International School, New Delhi; Nirmla Chowdhury, PGT, Sociology, Nehru Adarsh Senior Secondary School, Delhi; and Kiran Sharma, PGT, Sociology, Government Boys Senior Secondary School, President Estate, New Delhi, for providing their feedback and inputs. Special thanks are due to Shweta Rao, who took on the challenge of designing the book and made it possible to realize our efforts. Her contributions are visible in every page. The Council also acknowledges the support and contribution of Jesna Jayachandran, research scholar at the Center for the Study of Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Our special thanks to Satish Sabharwal, Professor, and N. Jayaram, Professor, members and of the Monitoring Committee, from whose meticulous comments and suggestions we benefited enormously. Finally, we are grateful to all the institutions and individuals who allowed us to use materials from their publications, each of which is acknowledged in the text. The NCERT is specially grateful to R.K. Laxman for allowing us to use his cartoons, Malavika Karlekar for the use of photographs from her book, Visualizing Indian Women 1875–1947, published by Oxford University Press, New Delhi; Radha Kumar for letting us use visuals from her book, The History of Doing, an illustrated account of movements for women's rights and feminism in India 1-800-1990, and Ravi Agarwal for his collection of photographs. We have also used some material and photographs from India Today, Outlook and Frontline, The Times of India, The Hindu and Hindustan Times. The Council thanks the authors, copyright holders and publishers of these materials. The NCERT gratefully acknowledges the Library of the Rail Museum, Chanakya Puri, New Delhi, Y.K. Gupta and R.C. Das of the Central Institute of Educational Technology, NCERT, New Delhi. The Council acknowledges the contribution of Natsya Khan, DTP operator, Dinesh Kumar, in charge, Computer Station, and Rishi Pal Singh, senior proofreader, NCERT, in shaping this textbook. We are grateful to the Publication Department, NCERT, for all its support. Suggestions for use. You have already gone through the earlier book. You are therefore familiar with the spirit of the national curriculum framework that the textbooks seek to communicate. The idea is to move away from learning by rote. The effort in the textbook is to give higher priority and space to opportunities for contemplation and wondering, discussion in small groups, and activities requiring hands-on experience. Every effort has been made to connect the subject matter to the contemporary social environment and to the everyday life of the child. Towards making this possible, we have boxes that draw from reports in newspapers, magazines, brief extracts from fiction, government reports, apart from the many examples to the everyday life of children. The exercises and activities in the textbook are, therefore, an essential part of the book. An effort has also been made to draw from sociological writings to give a flavor of sociological research. This has been a challenging, sometimes difficult task for us, and we are aware that your suggestions will go a long way to improve upon it. Please do write to us at the following address: the Head, Department of Education in Social Sciences and Humanities, NCERT, Sri Aurobindo Marg, New Delhi 110016. Or you can send email to nerdsociologytexts@gmail.com. We look forward to your responses, and especially your critical comments, including suggestions for improvements in the layout and format. We promise to acknowledge all useful suggestions in the next edition of the textbook. Contents. Chapter 1. Structural Change. Chapter 2. Cultural Change. Chapter 3. The Story of Indian Democracy. Chapter 4. Change and Development in Rural Society. Chapter 5. Change and Development in Industrial Society. Chapter 6. Globalization and Social Change. Chapter 7. Mass Media and Communications. Chapter 8. Social Movements. Chapter 1. Structural Change. 1. Structural change. Understanding the present usually involves some grasp of its past. This holds true probably as much for an individual or social group as for an entire country such as India. India has a long and rich history. While knowing about its past in ancient and medieval times is very important, its colonial experience is particularly significant for comprehending modern India. This is not just because many modern ideas and institutions reached India through colonialism. It is also because such an exposure to modern ideas was contradictory or paradoxical. For example, Indians in the colonial period read about Western liberalism and freedom. Yet they lived under a Western, colonial rule that denied Indians liberty and freedom. It is contradictions of this kind that shaped many of the structural and cultural changes that Chapter 1 and 2 looks at. As the next few chapters shall show, our social reform and nationalist movement, our laws, our political life and our constitution, our industry and agriculture, our cities and our villages have been shaped by our paradoxical experience with colonialism. This has had lasting implications for our specific experience with modernity. The following are just some of the many instances we face in our daily life. We have a parliamentary and a legal system, a police and educational system built very much on the British model. We drive on the left side of the road like the British. We have bread omelette and cutlets as menu offered in many roadside eateries and canteens. A very popular manufacturer of biscuits is actually named after Britain. Many school uniforms include neckties. We often admire the West and as often resent it. These are just some of the many and complex ways that British colonialism lives on in contemporary India. Let us take the example of the English language to show how its impact has been many-sided and paradoxical in India. This is not a matter about wrong spellings alone. English is not only widely used in India, but we now have an impressive body of literary writings by Indians in English. This knowledge of English has given Indians an edge in the global market. But English continues to be a mark of privilege. Not knowing English is a disadvantage that tells in the job market. At the same time, for those who were traditionally deprived of access to formal education such as the Dalits, knowledge of English may open doors of opportunities that were formerly closed. In this chapter we focus on structural changes that colonialism brought in. We, therefore, need to shift from this broad impressionistic view to a clearer understanding of colonialism as a structure and system. Colonialism brought into being new political, economic and social structural changes. In this chapter we look at only two of these structural changes, namely industrialization and urbanization. While the focus is on specific colonial context, we also briefly touch on developments after independence. All these structural changes were accompanied by cultural changes which we look at in the next chapter. However, any strict separation of the two is difficult. As you will see, the structural changes are difficult to discuss without some mention of the cultural changes too. 1.1 Understanding colonialism. At one level, colonialism simply means the establishment of rule by one country over another. In the modern period, Western colonialism has had the greatest impact. India's past has been marked by the entry of numerous groups of people at different times who have established their rule over different parts of what constitutes modern India today. The impact of colonial rule is distinguishable from all other earlier rules because the changes it brought in were far-reaching and deep. History is full of examples of the annexation of foreign territory and the domination of weaker by stronger powers. Nevertheless, there is a vital difference between the empire building of pre-capitalist times and that of capitalist times. Apart from outright pillage, the pre-capitalist conquerors benefited from their domination by exacting a continuous flow of tribute. On the whole, they did not interfere with the economic base. They simply took the tribute that was skimmed off the economic surplus that was produced traditionally in the subjugated areas. In contrast, British colonialism, which was based on a capitalist system, directly interfered to ensure greatest profit and benefit to British capitalism. Every policy was geared towards the strengthening and expansion of British capitalism. For instance, it changed the very laws of the land. It changed not just land ownership laws but decided even what crops ought to be grown and what ought not to be. It meddled with the manufacturing sector. It altered the way production and distribution of goods took place. It entered into the forests. It cleared trees and started tea plantations. It brought in forest acts that changed the lives of pastoralists. They were prevented from entering many forests that had earlier provided valuable forage for their cattle. The box carries a brief account of the impact of colonial forest policy in northeast India. Colonialism also led to considerable movement of people. It led to movement of people from one part to another within India. For instance, people from present-day Jharkhand moved to Assam to work on the tea plantations. A newly emerging middle class, particularly from the British Presidency regions of Bengal and Madras, moved as government employees, and professionals like doctors and lawyers moved to different parts of the country. People were carted in ships from India to work on other colonized lands in distant Asia, Africa and Americas. Many died on their way. Most could never return. Today many of their descendants are known as people of Indian origin. To facilitate the smooth functioning of its rule, colonialism introduced a wide array of changes in every sphere, be it legal or cultural or architectural. Colonialism was a story apart in the very scale and intensity of the changes that it brought about. Some of these changes were deliberate, while some took place in an unintended fashion. For example, we saw how Western education was introduced to create Indians who would manage British colonialism. Instead, it led to the growth of a nationalist and anti-colonial consciousness. This magnitude and depth of the structural changes that colonialism unleashed can be better grasped if we try and understand some basic features of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production are privately owned and organized to accumulate profits within a market system. We have already discussed the capitalist market in the first book, Indian Society. Capitalism in the West emerged out of a complex process of European exploration of the rest of the world, its plunder of wealth and resources, an unprecedented growth of science and technology, its harnessing to industries and agriculture. What marked capitalism from the very beginning was its dynamism, its potential to grow, expand, innovate, use technology and labor in a way best assured to ensure greatest profit. What marked it too was its global nature. Western colonialism was inextricably connected to the growth of Western capitalism. This had a lasting impact on the way capitalism developed in a colonized country like India. In the next section on industrialization and urbanization, we see how colonialism led to very distinct patterns. If capitalism became the dominant economic system, nation-states became the dominant political form. That we all live in nation-states and that we all have a nationality or a national citizenship may appear natural to us today. Before the First World War, passports were not widely used for international travel, and in most areas few people had one. Societies were, however, not always organized on these lines. Nation-state pertains to a particular type of state, characteristic of the modern world. A government has sovereign power within a defined territorial area, and the people are citizens of a single nation. Nation-states are closely associated with the rise of nationalism. The principle of nationalism assumes that any set of people have a right to be free and exercise sovereign power. It is an important part of the rise of democratic ideas. You will be reading more about this in Chapter 3. It must have struck you that the practice of colonialism and the principle of nationalism and democratic rights are contradictory. For colonial rule implied foreign rule such as British rule over India. Nationalism implied that the people of India or of any colonized society have an equal right to be sovereign. Indian nationalist leaders were quick to grasp this irony. They declared that freedom or Swaraj was their birth right and fought for both political and economic freedom. 1.2 Urbanization and Industrialization. The colonial experience. Industrialization refers to the emergence of machine production, based on the use of inanimate power resources like steam or electricity. In most standard Western textbook of sociology we learn that in even the most advanced of traditional civilizations, most people were engaged in working on the land. The relatively low level of technological development did not permit more than a small minority to be freed from the chores of agricultural production. By contrast, a prime feature of industrial societies today is that a large majority of the employed population work in factories, offices or shops rather than agriculture. Over 90% of people in the West live in towns and cities, where most jobs are to be found and new job opportunities are created. Not surprisingly, therefore, we usually associate urbanization with industrialization. They often do occur together but not always so. For instance, in Britain, the first society to undergo industrialization, was also the earliest to move from being rural to a predominantly urban country. In 1800, well under 20% of the population lived in towns or cities of more than 10,000 inhabitants. By 1900 this proportion had become 74%. The capital city, London, was home to about 1.1 million people in 1800. It increased in size to a population of over 7 million by the start of the 20th century. London was then by far the largest city ever seen in the world, a vast manufacturing, commercial and financial center at the heart of a still expanding British Empire. In India, the impact of the very same British industrialization led to deindustrialization in some sectors and decline of old urban centers. Just as manufacturing boomed in Britain, traditional exports of cotton and silk manufactures from India declined in the face of Manchester competition. This period also saw the further decline of cities such as Surat and Masilepatnam while Bombay and Madras grew. When the British took over Indian states, towns like Thanjavur, Dhaka, and Murhidabad lost their courts and, therefore, some of their artisans and court gentry. From the end of the 19th century, with the installation of mechanized factory industries, some towns became much more heavily populated. Urban luxury manufactures like the high-quality silks and cottons of Dhaka or Murshidabad must have been hit first by the almost simultaneous collapse of indigenous core demand and the external market on which these had largely depended. Village crafts in the interior, and particularly, in regions other than eastern India where British penetration was earliest and deepest, probably survived much longer, coming to be seriously affected only with the spread of railways. Unlike Britain where the impact of industrialization led to more people moving into urban areas, in India the initial impact of the same British industrialization led to more people moving into agriculture. The Census of India report shows this clearly. Sociological writings in India have often discussed both the contradictory and unintended consequences of colonialism. Comparisons have been made between the industrialization in the West and the growth of a Western middle class with that of the Indian experience. The box below carries one such observation. It also shows how industrialization is not just about new machine-based production but also a story of the growth of new social groups in society and new social relationships. In other words, it is about changes in the Indian social structure. Cities had a key role in the economic system of empires. Coastal cities such as Mumbai, Kolkata and Chennai were favored. From here primary commodities could be easily exported and manufactured goods could be cheaply imported. Colonial cities were the prime link between the economic center or core in Britain and periphery or margins in colonized India. Cities in this sense were the concrete expression of global capitalism. In British India, for example, Bombay was planned and redeveloped so that by 1900 over three-quarters of India's raw cotton were shipped through the city. Calcutta exported jute to Dundee while Madras sent coffee, sugar, indigo dyes and cotton to Britain. Urbanization in the colonial period saw the decline of some earlier urban centers and the emergence of new colonial cities. Kolkata was one of the first of such cities. In 1690, an English merchant named Job Charnock arranged to lease three villages, named Kalikata, Gobindapur, and Sudanuti, by the river Hugli in order to set up a trading post. In 1698, Fort William was established by the river for defensive purposes, and a large open area was cleared around the fort for military engagements. The fort and the open area, called Maidan, formed the core of the city that emerged rather rapidly. The tea plantations. We have already seen how industrialization and urbanization did not happen in India quite the way it did in Britain. More importantly, this is not because we began industrialization late but because our early industrialization and urbanization in the modern period were governed by colonial interests. We cannot go into details about different industries here. We simply take the case of the tea industry in India as an example. Official reports show how the colonial government often used unfair means to hire and forcibly keep laborers, and clearly acted on behalf of the British planters. From fictional and other accounts we get a glimpse of what life was for planters in this industry. Significantly, the colonial administrators were clear that harsh measures were taken against the laborers to make sure they benefited the planters. They were also fully aware that the laws of a colonized country did not have to stick to the democratic norms that the British back home had to follow in Britain. Industrialization in independent India. We saw in the earlier section how the colonial state had an important role in the way industrialization and urbanization took place in India. Here we very briefly touch upon how the independent Indian state played an active role in promoting industrialization, and in some sense was responding to the impact that colonialism had on the growth of industry in India. Chapter 5 will deal with Indian industrialization and its shift from the early years of independence to developments after 1990 with liberalization. For Indian nationalists, the issue of economic exploitation under colonial rule was a central issue. Images of pre-colonial fabled riches of India contrasted with the poverty of British India. The Swadeshi movement strengthened the loyalty to the national economy. Modern ideas made people realize that poverty was preventable. Indian nationalists saw rapid industrialization of the economy as the path towards both growth and social equity. Development of heavy and machine-making industries, expansion of the public sector and holding of a large cooperative sector were considered very important. A modern and prosperous India, as visualized by Jawaharlal Nehru, was to be built on an edifice of giant steel plants or gigantic dams and power stations. Read Nehru's remarks on the Bhakra-Nangal Dam. Our engineers tell us that probably nowhere else in the world is there a dam as high as this. The work bristles with difficulties and complications. As I walked around the site, I thought that these days the biggest temple and mosques and gurdwara is the place where man works for the good of mankind. Which place can be greater than this Bhakra-Nangal, where thousands and lakhs of men have worked, have shed their blood and sweat and laid down their lives as well. Urbanization in independent India. You would be more than aware of increasing urbanization in India. Recent years of globalization have led to enormous expansion and change of cities. We shall be dealing with that later in Chapter 6. Here we draw from a sociological account of the different kinds of urbanization in India. Writing on the different kinds of urbanization witnesses in the first 2 decades after independence, sociologist M.S.A. Rao argued that in India many villages all over India are becoming increasingly subject to the impact of urban influences. But the nature of urban impact varies according to the kind of relations a village has with a city or town. He describes 3 different situations of urban impact as mentioned in the box. Conclusion. It will be obvious to you that colonialism is not just a topic in history but something which lives on in complex ways in our lives even today. It is also evident from the above account that industrialization and urbanization implies not just changes in production systems, technological innovations, density of settlements but also a way of life. You shall be reading more about industrialization and urbanization in independent India in Chapter 5 and 6. Virtually English. Housewives and college students who know English take up plum assignments as online scorers in BPOs, writes K. Jeshi. It is a familiar classroom scene. The only unfamiliar thing is the setting. Computer screens turn blackboards and housewives take over as teachers to evaluate English essays written by non-English speaking students in Asia. All, at the click of the mouse. The encouraging comments given by the evaluators here motivate students in Japan, Korea and China to learn English. Online education, the new wave in the BPO segment, is bringing cheer to those who want to earn a fast buck. All you need is a flair for English, creative skills, basic computer knowledge, the drive to go that extra mile and willingness to learn. Source: The Hindu, Thursday, May 4, 2006. Forest policy in the colonial period in northeast India. The advent of the railways in Bengal marked an important turning point, which saw the conversion of its forest policy in Assam. Assam was then part of the Bengal province, from one of laissez-faire into one of active intervention. The demand for railway sleepers transformed the forests in Assam. This included all the present-day 7 sister states, from an unproductive wilderness into a lucrative source of revenue for the colonial administration. Between 1861 and 1878, an area of approximately 269 square miles had been constituted as reserved forests. By 1894, the area had gone up to 3,683 square miles. And, by the end of the 19th century, the area of forests under the department was 20,061 square miles, constituting 42.2% of the total area of the province, of which 3,609 square miles comprised reserved forests. Significantly, large areas of these forests are located in the hill areas, occupied by tribal communities who for centuries depended upon and lived in close harmony with nature. Nongri, 2003. How were laborers recruited? Tea industry began in India in 1851. Most of the tea gardens were situated in Assam. In 1903, the industry employed 79,000 permanent and 93,000 temporary employees. Since Assam was sparsely populated and the tea plantations were often located on uninhabited hillsides, bulk of the sorely needed labor had to be imported from other provinces. But to bring thousands of people every year from their far-off homes into strange lands, possessing an unhealthy climate and infected with strange fevers, required the provision of financial and other incentives, which the tea planters of Assam were unwilling to offer. Instead, they had recourse to fraud and coercion, and they persuaded the government to aid and abet them in this unholy task by passing penal laws. The recruitment of laborers for tea gardens of Assam was carried on for years mostly by contractors under the provisions of the Transport of Native Laborers Act No. 3, of 1863. Of Bengal as amended in 1865, 1870 and 1873. From Curzon's speeches 2. The labor system in Assam was essentially that of indenture by which the laborers went to Assam under contract for a number of years. The government helped the planters by providing for penal sanction in case of non-fulfillment of the contract by the laborers. This view is explicitly made by T. Raleigh, law member, when speaking on the Assam Labor and Emigration Bill of 1901. The labor contract authorized by this bill is a transaction by which, to put it rather bluntly, a man is often committed to Assam before he knows what he is doing, and is thereupon held to his promise for 4 years, with a threat of arrest and imprisonment if he fails to perform it. Conditions like these have no place in the ordinary law of master and servant. We made them part of the law of British India at the instance and for the benefit of the planters of Assam. The fact remains that the motive power in this legislation is the interest of the planter, not the interest of the coolie. How did the planters live? Parbatpuri had always been an important offloading and loading point. The doughty British managers and their mems always came down from the estates surrounding Parbatpuri when a steamer docked there. In spite of the inaccessibility of the gardens, they had lived lives of luxury. Huge, sprawling bungalows, set on sturdy wooden stilts to protect the inmates from wild animals, were surrounded by velvety lawns and jewel-bright flower beds. They had trained a large number of Malis, bawarchis and bearers to serve them to perfection. Their wide verandahed houses gleamed and glistened under the ministrations of this army of liveried servants. Of course, everything from scouring powder to self-raising flour, from safety pins to silverware, from delicate Nottingham lace tablecloths to bath salts, had come up the river on the steamers. Indeed, even the large cast-iron bathtubs that were invitingly placed in huge bathrooms, tubs which were filled every morning by busy bistawalas carrying buckets up from the bungalow's well, had been brought up via steamer. National Planning Committee 1938. Nearly a decade before the country's independence, in 1938 a National Planning Committee with Jawaharlal Nehru as the chairman and K.T. Shah as the general editor was set up by the Indian National Congress. The committee started functioning in 1939, but it could not make much headway as the chairman was arrested by the British and the war broke out. Notwithstanding these obstacles, 29 subcommittees divided into 8 groups were set up to deal with all aspects of national life and to work in accordance with a predetermined plan. The major areas on which the committee focused its attention were A. Agriculture and other sources of primary production. B. Industries or other secondary sources of production. C. Human factor, labor and population. D. Exchange and finance. E. Public utilities, transport and communication. F. Social services, health and housing. G. Education, general and technical. H. Woman's role in a planned economy. Among the subcommittees, some submitted their final reports and several others interim reports before India became independent. Several reports were published by 1948 to 1949. The Planning Commission was set up in March 1950 by a resolution of the Government of India, which is defining the scope of the Commission's work. Migrant labours. Firstly, there are villages in which a sizable number of people have sought employment in far-off cities. They live there, leaving behind the members of their families in their natal villages. In Madhapur, a village in north-central India, 77 out of 298 households have migrants, and a little less than half of all the migrants work in two cities of Bombay and Calcutta. About 75% of the total migrants send money regularly, and 83% visit the village from 4 to 5 times a year to once in 2 years. A considerable number of emigrants reside not only in Indian cities but also in overseas towns. For instance, there are many overseas migrants from Gujarat villages living in African and British towns. They have built fashionable houses in their natal villages, invested money on land and industry, and have donated literally to the establishment of educational institutions and trusts. The second kind of urban impact is to be seen in villages which are situated near an industrial town. When an industrial town like Bhilai comes up in the midst of villages, some villages are totally uprooted while the lands of others are partially acquired. The latter are found to receive an influx of immigrant workers, which not only stimulates a demand for houses and a market inside the village but creates problems of ordering relationships between the native residents and the immigrants. The growth of metropolitan cities accounts for the third type of urban impact on the surrounding villages. While a few villages are totally absorbed in the process of expansion, only the land of many others, excluding the inhabited area, is used for urban development. 2. Cultural change. We saw in the last chapter how colonialism brought in changes that altered the structure of Indian society. Industrialization and urbanization transformed the lives of people. Factories replaced fields as places of work for some. Cities replaced villages as places to live for many. Living and working arrangements or structures changed. Changes also took place in culture, ways of life, norms, values, fashions, and even body language. Sociologists understand social structure as a continuing arrangement of persons in relationships defined or controlled by institutions, and culture as socially established norms or patterns of behavior. You have already studied about the structural changes that colonialism brought about in Chapter 1. You will observe how important those structural changes are for understanding the cultural changes that this chapter seeks to understand. This chapter looks at two related developments, both a complex product of the impact of colonial rule. The first deals with the deliberate and conscious efforts made by the 19th century social reformers and early 20th century nationalists to bring in changes in social practices that discriminated against women and lower castes. The second with the less deliberate yet decisive changes in cultural practices that can broadly be understood as the four processes of Sanskritization, Modernization, Secularization and Westernization. Sanskritization predates the coming of colonial rule. The other three processes can be understood better as complex responses of the people of India to the changes that colonialism brought about. 2.1 Social reform movements in the 19th and early 20th century. You have already seen the far-reaching impact of colonialism on our lives. The social reform movements which emerged in India in the 19th century arose to the challenges that colonial Indian society faced. You probably are familiar with what were termed social evils that plagued Indian society. The well-known issues are that of sati, child marriage, widow remarriage and caste discrimination. It is not that attempts were not made to fight social discrimination in pre-colonial India. They were central to Buddhism. They were central to Bhakti and Sufi movements. What marked these 19th-century social reform attempts was the modern context and mix of ideas. It was a creative combination of modern ideas of Western liberalism and a new look on traditional literature. Sociologist Satish Sabharwal elaborates upon the modern context by sketching three aspects to the modern framework of change in colonial India: modes of communication, forms of organization, and the nature of ideas. New technologies speeded up various forms of communication. The printing press, telegraph, and later the microphone, movement of people and goods through steamship and railways helped quick movement of new ideas. Within India, social reformers from Punjab and Bengal exchanged ideas with reformers from Madras and Maharashtra. Keshav Chandra Sen of Bengal visited Madras in 1864. Pandita Ramabai traveled to different corners of the country. Some of them went to other countries. Christian missionaries reached remote corners of present-day Nagaland, Mizoram and Meghalaya. Modern social organizations like the Brahmo Samaj in Bengal and Arya Samaj in Punjab were set up. The All India Muslim Ladies Conference, Anjuman Wadnilam, was founded in 1914. Indian reformers debated not just in public meetings but through public media like newspapers and journals. Translations of writings of social reformers from one Indian language to another took place. For instance, Vishnu Shastri published a Marathi translation of Vidyasagar's book in Indu Prakash in 1868. New ideas of liberalism and freedom, new ideas of homemaking and marriage, new roles for mothers and daughters, new ideas of self-conscious pride in culture and tradition emerged. The value of education became very important. It was seen as very crucial for a nation to become modern but also retain its ancient heritage. The idea of female education was debated intensely. Significantly, it was the social reformer Jyotiba Phule who opened the first school for women in Pune. Reformers argued that for a society to progress, women have to be educated. Some of them believed that in pre-modern India, women were educated. Others contested this on the grounds that this was so only of a privileged few. Thus attempts to justify female education were made by recourse to both modern and traditional ideas. They actively debated the meanings of tradition and modernity. Jyotiba Phule thus recalled the glory of pre-Aryan age while others like Bal Gangadhar Tilak emphasized the glory of the Aryan period. In other words, 19th century reform initiated a period of questioning, reinterpretations in both intellectual and social growth. The varied social reform movements did have common themes. Yet there were also significant differences. For some, the concerns were confined to the problems that the upper caste, middle class women and men faced. For others, the injustices suffered by the discriminated castes were central questions. For some, social evils had emerged because of a decline of the true spirit of Hinduism. For others, caste and gender oppression was intrinsic to the religion. Likewise, Muslim social reformers actively debated the meaning of polygamy and purdah. For example, a resolution against the evils of polygamy was proposed by Jahanara Shah Nawaz at the All India Muslim Ladies Conference. She argued, "The kind of polygamy which is practiced by certain sections of the Muslims is against the true spirit of the Quran, and it is the duty of the educated women to exercise their influence among the relations to put an end to this practice." The resolution condemning polygamy caused considerable debate in the Muslim press. Tasabeniswan, the leading journal for women in the Punjab, came out in favor of the resolve, but others disapproved. Chaudhary 1993, 111. Debates within communities were common during this period. For instance, sati was opposed by the Brahmo Samaj. Orthodox members of the Hindu community in Bengal formed an organization called Dharma Sabha and petitioned the British, arguing that reformers had no right to interpret sacred texts. Yet another view increasingly voiced by Dalits was a complete rejection of the Hindu fold. For instance, using the tools of modern education, Muktabai, a 13-year-old student in Phule's school, writes in 1852, "Let that religion, where only one person is privileged and the rest are deprived, perish from this earth. And let it never enter our minds to be proud of such a religion." 2.2 How do we approach the study of Sanskritisation, modernization? Secularization and Westernization. In this chapter, each of the four concepts, namely Sanskritization, Modernization, Secularization, and Westernization, are dealt with in different sections. But as the discussion unfolds, it will become obvious to you that in many ways they overlap and in many situations they coexist. In many situations they operate very differently. It is not surprising to find the same person being modern in some ways and traditional in another. This coexistence is often seen as natural to India and many other non-Western countries. But you know that sociology does not rest content with naturalist explanation. Recall the discussion in Chapter 1, Book 1 NCERT 2006, as the last chapter has shown colonial modernity had its own paradoxes. Take the example of Western education. Colonialism led to the growth of an English-educated Indian middle class. They read the thinkers of Western Enlightenment, philosophers of liberal democracy, and dreamt of ushering in a liberal and progressive India. And yet, humiliated by colonial rule, they asserted their pride in traditional learning and scholarship. You have already seen this trend in the 19th century reform movements. As this chapter will show, modernity spelled not merely new ideas but also rethinking and reinterpretation of tradition. Both culture and tradition are living entities. People learn them and in turn modify them. Take the everyday example of how the sari or Jain Sem or sarong is worn in India today. Traditionally, the sari, a loose unstitched piece of cloth, was differently worn in different regions. The standard way that the modern middle-class woman wears it was a novel combination of the traditional sari with the Western petticoat and blouse. But you know that sociology does not rest content with naturalist explanation. Recall the discussion in Chapter 1, Book 1 NCERT 2006, as the last chapter has shown colonial modernity had its own paradoxes. Take the example of Western education. Colonialism led to the growth of an English-educated Indian middle class. They read the thinkers of Western Enlightenment, philosophers of liberal democracy, and dreamt of ushering in a liberal and progressive India. And yet, humiliated by colonial rule, they asserted their pride in traditional learning and scholarship. You have already seen this trend in the 19th century reform movements. As this chapter will show, modernity spelled not merely new ideas but also rethinking and reinterpretation of tradition. Both culture and tradition are living entities. People learn them and in turn modify them. Take the everyday example of how the sari or Jain Sem or sarong is worn in India today. Traditionally, the sari, a loose unstitched piece of cloth, was differently worn in different regions. The standard way that the modern middle-class woman wears it was a novel combination of the traditional sari with the Western petticoat and blouse. India's structural and cultural diversity is self-evident. This diversity shapes the different ways that modernization or westernization, Sanskritization or secularization affects or does not affect different groups of people. The following pages seek to capture these differences. The constraint of space prevents a further detailing out. It is up to you to explore and identify the complex ways modernization impacts people in different parts of the country, or impacts different classes and castes in the same region, and even women and men from the same class or community. We begin with the concept Sanskritization. The reason for doing so is because it refers to a process that pertains to social mobility that existed before the onset of colonialism, and persisted in diverse ways subsequently. The other three changes, as we shall shortly see, arose in a context marked by changes that colonialism brought about. This included direct exposure to modern Western ideas of freedom and rights. As mentioned earlier, this exposure heightened the sense of injustice on the one hand and humiliation on the other. Often this led to a desire to go back to one's traditional past and heritage. It is within this mix that we can understand India's tryst with modernization, westernization, and secularization. 2.3 Different kinds of social change. Sanskritisation. The term Sanskritization was coined by M.N. Srinivas. It may be briefly defined as the process by which a low caste or tribe or other group takes over the customs, ritual, beliefs, ideology and style of life of a high and, in particular, a twice-born, Dwija, caste. The impact of Sanskritization is many-sided. Its influence can be seen in language, literature, ideology, music, dance, drama, style of life and ritual. It is primarily a process that takes place within the Hindu space, though Srinivas argued that it was visible even in sects and religious groups outside Hinduism. Studies of different areas, however, show that it operated differently in different parts of the country. In those areas where a highly Sanskritized caste was dominant, the culture of the entire region underwent a certain amount of Sanskritization. In regions where the non-Sanskritic castes were dominant, it was their influence that was stronger. This can be termed the process of desanskritization. There were other regional variations too. In Punjab, culturally Sanskritic influence was never very strong. For many centuries until the third quarter of the 19th century, the Persian influence was the dominant one. Srinivas argued that the Sanskritization of a group has usually the effect of improving its position in the local caste hierarchy. It normally presupposes either an improvement in the economic or political position of the group concerned or a higher group self-consciousness resulting from its contact with a source of the great tradition of Hinduism, such as a pilgrim center or a monastery or a proselytizing sect. But in a highly unequal society such as India, there were and still are obstacles to any easy taking over of the customs of the higher castes by the lower. Indeed, traditionally, the dominant caste punished those low castes, which were audacious enough to attempt it. The story below captures the problem. Kumud Pawade in her autobiography recounts how a Dalit woman became a Sanskrit teacher. As a student, she is drawn towards the study of Sanskrit, perhaps because it is the means through which she can break into a field that was not possible for her to enter on grounds of gender and caste. Perhaps she was drawn towards it because it would enable her to read in the original what the texts have to say about women and the Dalits. As she proceeds with her studies, she meets with varied reactions ranging from surprise to hostility, from guarded acceptance to brutal rejection. As she says, "The result is that although I try to forget my caste, it is impossible to forget. And then I remember an expression I heard somewhere, what comes by birth, but cannot be cast off by dying, that is caste." Sanskritization suggests a process whereby people want to improve their status through adoption of names and customs of culturally high-placed groups. The reference model is usually financially better of. In both, the aspiration or desire to be like the higher-placed group occurs only when people become wealthier. Sanskritization as a concept has been critiqued at different levels. 1. It has been criticized for exaggerating social mobility or the scope of lower castes to move up the social ladder. For it leads to no structural change but only positional change of some individuals. In other words, inequality continues to persist, though some individuals may be able to improve their positions within the unequal structure. 2. It has been pointed out that the ideology of Sanskritization accepts the ways of the upper caste as superior and that of the lower caste as inferior. Therefore, the desire to imitate the upper caste is seen as natural and desirable. Third, Sanskritization seems to justify a model that rests on inequality and exclusion. It appears to suggest that to believe in pollution and purity of groups of people is justifiable or all right. Therefore, to be able to look down on some groups just as the upper castes look down on the lower castes, is a mark of privilege. In society where such a worldview exists, imagining an equal society becomes difficult. The study on the next page shows how the very idea of purity and pollution are valued or seen as worthwhile ideas to have. Although goldsmith castes are people higher than me, our caste rules prohibit our taking food or water from them. We have a belief that goldsmiths are so greedy that they wash excrement to dig out gold. Although higher in caste, they are therefore more polluting than we are. We also do not take food from other higher castes who do polluting things, washermen, who work with dirty clothes, and oil pressers, who crush and kill seeds to make oil. It shows how such discriminatory ideas become a way of life. Instead of aspiring for an equal society, the excluded and discriminated seek to give their own meaning to their excluded status. In other words, they aspire to be in a position from where they can in turn look down on other people. This reflects an essentially undemocratic vision. Fourth, since Sanskritization results in the adoption of upper caste rites and rituals, it leads to practices of secluding girls and women, adopting dowry practices instead of bride price, and practicing caste discrimination against other groups, etc. Fifth, the effect of such a trend is that the key characteristics of Dalit culture and society are eroded. For example, the very worth of labor which lower castes do is degraded and rendered shameful. Identities based on the basis of work, crafts and artisanal abilities, knowledge, forms of medicine, ecology, agriculture, animal husbandry, etc., are regarded useless in the industrial era. With the growth of the anti-Brahminical movement and the development of regional self-consciousness in the 20th century, there was an attempt in several Indian languages to drop Sanskrit words and phrases. A crucial result of the backward classes movement was to emphasize the role of secular factors in the upward mobility of caste groups and individuals. In the case of the dominant castes, there was no longer any desire to pass for the Vaisyas, Kshatriyas and Brahmins. On the other hand, it was prestigious to be a member of the dominant caste. Recent years have seen likewise assertions of Dalits who now pride their identity as Dalits. However, sometimes as among the poorest and the most marginalized of the Dalit caste groups, caste identity seems to compensate their marginality in other domains. In other words, they have gained some pride and self-confidence but otherwise remain excluded and discriminated. Westernization. You have already read about our Western colonial past. You have seen how it often brought about changes that were paradoxical and strange. M.N. Srinivas defines Westernization as the changes brought about in Indian society and culture as a result of over 150 years of British rule, the term subsuming changes occurring at different levels: technology, institutions, ideology and values. There were different kinds of Westernization. One kind refers to the emergence of a westernized subcultural pattern through a minority section of Indians who first came in contact with Western culture. This included the subculture of Indian intellectuals who not only adopted many cognitive patterns, or ways of thinking, and styles of life, but supported its expansion. Many of the early 19th century reformers were of this kind. The boxes show the different kinds of Westernization. There were, therefore, small sections of people who adopted Western lifestyles or were affected by Western ways of thinking. Apart from this, there has been also the general spread of Western cultural traits, such as the use of new technology, dress, food, and changes in the habits and styles of people in general. Across the country, a very wide section of middle-class homes have a television set, a fridge, some kind of sofa set, a dining table and chair in the living room. Westernization does involve the imitation of external forms of culture. It does not necessarily mean that people adopt modern values of democracy and equality. Apart from ways of life and thinking, the West influenced Indian art and literature. Artists like Ravi Varma, Abanindranath Tagore, Chandu Menon and Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay were all grappling with the colonial encounter. The box below captures the many ways that style, technique and the very theme of an artist like Ravi Varma were shaped by Western and indigenous traditions. It discusses the portrait of a family in a matrilineal community of Kerala, but one that significantly resembles the very typical patrilineal nuclear family of the modern West, consisting of the father, mother and children. You can see the many diverse levels that, resulting from our colonial encounter with the West, took place. In the contemporary context, often conflicts between generations are seen as cultural conflicts resulting from Westernization. The following account in the next page captures this gap. Have you seen this or faced this? Is Westernization the only reason for generational conflicts? Are conflicts necessarily bad? Srinivas suggested that while lower castes sought to be Sanskritized, upper castes sought to be Westernized. In a diverse country such as India, this generalization is difficult to maintain. For instance, studies of Thais, by no means considered upper caste, in Kerala show conscious efforts to Westernize. Elite Thias appropriated British culture as a move towards a more cosmopolitan life that critiqued caste. Likewise, Western education often implied opening up to new opportunities for different groups of people in the Northeast. Read the following account. We usually refer to the colonial impact to discuss Westernization. However, often we find new forms of Westernization in the contemporary period. Activity 2.6 draws attention to this. Modernization and Secularization. The term modernization has a long history. From the 19th, and more so the 20th century, the term began to be associated with positive and desirable values. People and societies wanted to be modern. In the early years, modernization referred to improvement in technology and production processes. Increasingly, however, the term had a wider usage. It referred to the path of development that much of West Europe or North America has taken, and suggested that other societies both have to and ought to follow the same path of development. In India, the beginnings of capitalism, as we saw in Chapter 1, took place within the colonial context. The story of our modernization and secularization is, therefore, quite distinct from their growth in the West. This is evident when we discussed Westernization and the efforts of the 19th century social movements earlier in this chapter. Here we look into the two processes of modernization and secularization together, for they are linked. They are both part of a set of modern ideas. Sociologists have tried to define what exactly constitutes the modernization process. Modernity assumes that local ties and parochial perspectives give way to universal commitments and cosmopolitan attitudes, that the truths of utility, calculation, and science take precedence over those of the emotions, the sacred, and the non-rational, that the individual rather than the group be the primary unit of society and politics, that the associations in which men live and work be based on choice not birth, that mastery rather than fatalism orient their attitude toward the material and human environment, that identity be chosen and achieved, not ascribed and affirmed, that work be separated from family, residence, and community and bureaucratic organization. Rudolph and Rudolph, 1967. In other words, it means that people are influenced not just by local but universal contexts. How you behave, what you think is no longer decided by your family or tribe or caste or community. What job you wish to do is decided not by the job your parent is, but by what you wish to do. Work gets based on choice, not birth. Who you are depends on what you achieve, not by who you are. A scientific attitude gains ground. A rational approach matters. Is this entirely true? In India, often the job we do is not by choice. A scavenger does not choose her job. Chapter 5 Book 1, NCERT 2007, we often marry within a caste or community. Religious beliefs continue to dominate our lives. At the same time, we do have a scientific tradition. We also have a vibrant secular and democratic political system. At the same time, we have caste and community-based mobilization. How do we understand these processes? This chapter has been trying to understand this mix. It would be simplistic, however, to term the complex combinations just as a mix of tradition and modernity, as though tradition and modernity themselves are fixed entities, or as though India has or had just one set of traditions. We have already seen that both plurality and a tradition of argumentation have been defining features of traditions in India. They are in fact constantly being redefined. We have already observed this with 19th century social reformers. This process, however, persists today. The box below describes such a process in contemporary Arunachal Pradesh. In the modern West, secularization has usually meant a process of decline in the influence of religion. It has been an assumption of all theorists of modernization that modern societies become increasingly secular. Indicators of secularization have referred to levels of involvement with religious organizations, such as rates of church attendance, the social and material influence of religious organizations, and the degree to which people hold religious beliefs. Recent years have, however, seen an unprecedented growth of religious consciousness and conflict world over. However, even in the past, a view that assumed that modern ways would necessarily lead to decline in religious ways has not been entirely true. You will recall how Western and modern forms of communication, organization, and ideas led to the emergence of new kinds of religious reform organizations. Furthermore, a considerable part of ritual in India has direct reference to the pursuit of secular ends. Rituals have also secular dimensions as distinct from secular goals. They provide men and women with occasions for socializing with their peers and superiors, and for showing off the family's wealth, clothing and jewelry. During the last few decades in particular, the economic, political and status dimensions of ritual have become increasingly conspicuous, and the number of cars lined up outside a wedding house and the VIPs who attended the wedding provide the index to the household standing in the local community. There has also been considerable debate about what is seen by some as secularization of caste. What does this mean? In traditional India, caste system operated within a religious framework. Belief systems of purity and pollution were central to its practice. Today it often functions as political pressure groups. Contemporary India has seen such formation of caste associations and caste political parties. They seek to press upon the state their demands. Such a changed role of caste has been described as secularization of caste. The box below illustrates this process. Conclusion. This chapter has sought to show the distinct ways that social change has taken place in India. The colonial experience had lasting consequences. Many of these were unintended and paradoxical. Western ideas of modernity shaped the imagination of Indian nationalists. It also prompted a fresh look at traditional texts by some. It also led to a rejection of these by others. Western cultural forms found their place in spheres ranging from how families lived to what codes of conduct should men, women and children have to artistic expressions. The ideas of equality and democracy made a huge impact, as evident in both the reform movements and the nationalist movement. This led not just to adoption of Western ideas, but also an active questioning and reinterpretation of tradition. The next chapter on the India's experience with democracy will again show how a constitution based on radical ideas of equality and social justice functioned in a society that is deeply unequal. It will further show the complex ways that both tradition and modernity constantly got and is getting redefined. Ways of Thinking. Box 2.2. John Stuart Mill's essay, On Liberty, soon after its publication, became a text in Indian colleges. Indians came to know about Magna Carta, and the struggle for liberty and equality in Europe and America. Ways of Living. Box 2.3. Devaki recalls that when she was small, in her house boiled eggs were eaten in egg cups, and her mother would make the porridge and serve it separately on the table with the hot milk and sugar, to be mixed in each person's bowl. This was distinctly different from other households. Devaki says, where boiled eggs were not eaten in egg cups and where the porridge, milk and sugar were all mixed together, cooked in a pan, and then served. She remembers asking her mother why they ate porridge like that, and her mother saying that this was the way they used to eat porridge in the estate. Abraham 2006, 146. Box 2.4. In 1870, Ravi Varma received his first paid commission to paint the portrait of Kizak Polit Krishna Menon's family. This is a transitional work which blends elements of a flatter, two-dimensional style popular within earlier watercolors with the newer techniques of perspective and illusionism, made possible by the use of a medium like oil. Another feature is the technique of spatial organizations of the seated and figures in deference to age and hierarchy, which is once again reminiscent of 19th-century European portraits of the bourgeois family. How strange then this portrait was painted in matrilineal Kerala at a time when most of the Nayars, Krishna Menon's caste, would have been unused to living in patrilocal nuclear families. Activity 2.5. Can you think of Indians who are very Western in their clothes and appearances but who do not have democratic and egalitarian values that are part of modern attitudes? We are giving two examples below. Can you think of other instances from both real and real life? Box 2.6. We may find people who are Western educated but holding very prejudiced views about particular ethnic or religious communities. A family can adopt external forms of Western culture like the way the interiors of houses are done up but may have very conservative ideas about women's role in society. The practice of female feticide combines discriminatory attitude towards women and the use of very modern technology. You should also discuss that whether this contradiction is only true for the Indians or non-Western societies. Or is it not equally true that racist and discriminatory attitudes exist in Western societies? Another feature is the technique of spatial organizations of the seated and figures in deference to age and hierarchy, which is once again reminiscent of 19th-century European portraits of the bourgeois family. How strange then this portrait was painted in matrilineal Kerala at a time when most of the Nayars, Krishna Menon's caste, would have been unused to living in patrilocal nuclear families. Box 2.5. And though they are of my own flesh and blood, they sometimes seem like total strangers to me. I no longer have anything in common with them, neither with their ways of thinking, nor with the way they dress up, talk or behave. They are the new generation. And my mental makeup is such that any sort of mutuality between them and me becomes impossible. Yet I love them with all my heart. I give them whatever they desire, for their happiness is all I want. Rabindranath's words set my heart in a tremulous feeling. This is your time, for now is the beginning of my end. I have nothing in common with my children Pallav, Kallal and Kinkini. Pallav lives in a different country, in a different culture altogether. We, for instance, had worn the mekhala chador from the age of 12. But now my daughter Kinkini, a student of business management at Gauhati University, wears pant and buggy shirts. And Kallal likes to sport a mass of unruly hair on his head. When I feel listening to a Meera bhajan, Kallal and Kinkini choose to play their favorite pop numbers by Whitney Houston. At times, when I feel like singing a few lines of Barjeet, Kinkin likes to play Western tunes on her guitar. Box 2.6. My grandfather, like most Nagas who had come into close contact with Europeans, was convinced that education was the only way to get ahead in life. He aspired for his children the kind of life he had seen being lived by the British administration and missionaries. He sent my mother away to school first in neighboring Assam, then as far away as Shimla. My mother was encouraged by one of the more educated men in her village who told her that with an education in these new times, she could even become like the Indian lady who spoke before the world Vijayalakshmi Pandit, sister of Nehru, who represented India at the UN. My father, by dint of his own intelligence and hard work, put himself through the local mission school and college in Shillong. All Nagas of my parents' generation who were able to, chose to get educated in English. For them it was more than a gateway to upward mobility. In a region where tribes that live no more than 20 km apart speak completely different languages, it was a medium through which they could communicate amongst themselves and with the world. They became the voice of their people and made English the official state language. AU 2005, 111. Activity 2.6. Observe the many small and big ways that Westernization affects our lives. You have already seen how British colonialism affected our lives. How Westernization meant emulating or wanting to be like the British. Increasingly we find Westernization being more Americanization. Read a recent letter to the editor of a newspaper given below and discuss. The new Raj, presumably to set itself apart from the continent, Britain and Ireland, from where its founders had come, the US chose to partly reverse the datamontier format and create its own month data year 1. The 11th of September, the day of the attack on the World Trade Center in New York, automatically became 9/11. As this was the shorthand which the US used, the rest of the world used it too. Never mind that in most countries the number of a month in a year follows that of a day in a month. How do we explain the fact that the shorthand used in the Mumbai train blasts is 7/11? We were a British colony, so we mostly use the DDMMYY format, the Hindu August 21, 2006. At one time many Indians sought to speak English the British way. Has there been a change in this? Is American accent more influential now? What kind of modernity? They, upper caste founders of various organizations and conferences, pretend to be modernists as long as they are in the service of the British government. The moment they retire and claim their pensions, they get into their Brahmanical Touchmanat attire. Box 2.7. With the advent of progress and the influences of modernization, attitudes have changed to religion and to the celebration of the many festivals. Rituals, procedures of ceremonies, taboos associated with these ceremonies, the value and amount of sacrifices to be made, are now all subjects of constant change, especially in the mushrooming urban areas. These new pressures on the concept of tribal identity have meant that traditional practices and their preservation have become almost a necessary expression of being tribal. Festivals have emerged as an emphatic projection of that sense of a unified tribe identity. It is as if the collective celebration of the festival has become a fitting response to the clarion call of loss of culture, loss of identity, that is doing the rounds in today's tribal society. It is currently a common practice for festival celebration committees to be formed in place of the traditionally loose-knit work gang for the celebration of the festival. Traditionally, seasonal cycles determined the days of the celebration. Now dates for the celebration have been formalized, with each marked on the official government calendar. At these festival celebrations, flags of no definite design, chief guests and speeches, and Miss Festival contests have become the new necessities. With rational concepts and worldviews infiltrating the minds of the tribal people, the practice and performance of the old faith is under due and undue scrutiny. Connecting to God. Are you distressed because your planned trip to the Meenakshi Amman temple in Madurai on your wedding anniversary will not materialize? Stop worrying. You are just a mouse click away from ordering an online puja on the web and getting the blessings of the deity. .com offers puja service in over 600 temples spread all over the country. People all over the world can order for a puja to be performed at a temple of their choice, in Kanyakumari or in Uttar Pradesh, to their favorite deity. The puja is performed as per the browser's requirement through a network of franchisees, mostly temple priests, spread across the country, and the prasadam is delivered to anywhere in the world, within 5 to 7 days. For residents of India who cannot pay through credit cards, .com performs the puja and collects the payment through check or demand draft. The online puja service costs anywhere from $9.75 for a basic puja performed at any temple that you wish to a $75 for combination pujas. Box 2.8. Everyone recognizes that the traditional social system in India was organized around caste structures and caste identities. In dealing with the relationship between caste and politics, however, the doctrinaire modernizer suffers from a serious xenophobia. He begins with the questions: is caste disappearing? Now, surely no social system disappears like that. A more useful point of departure would be, what form is caste taking under the impact of modern politics, and what form is politics taking in a caste-oriented society? Those in India who complain of casteism in politics are really looking for a sort of politics, which has no basis in society. Politics is a competitive enterprise, its purpose is the acquisition of power for the realization of certain goals, and its process is one of identifying and manipulating existing and emerging allegiances in order to mobilize and consolidate positions. The important thing is organization and articulation of support, and where politics is mass-based, the point is to articulate support through the organizations in which the masses are to be found. It follows that where the caste structure provides one of the principal organizational clusters along which the bulk of the population is found to live, politics must strive to organize through such a structure. Politicians mobilize caste groupings and identities in order to organize their power. Where there are other types of groups and other bases of association, politicians approach them as well. And as they everywhere change the form of such organizations, they change the form of caste as well. 3. The story of Indian democracy. We are all familiar with the idea that democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Democracies fall into two basic categories: direct and representative. In a direct democracy, all citizens, without the intermediary of elected or appointed officials, can participate in making public decisions. Such a system is clearly only practical with relatively small numbers of people, in a community organization or tribal council, for example, or the local unit of a trade union, where members can meet in a single room to discuss issues and arrive at decisions by consensus or majority vote. Modern society, with its size and complexity, offers few opportunities for direct democracy. Today, the most common form of democracy, whether for a town of 50,000 or nations of 1 billion, is representative democracy, in which citizens elect officials to make political decisions, formulate laws, and administer programs for the public good. Ours is a representative democracy. Every citizen has the important right to vote her, his representative. People elect their representatives to all levels from panchayats, municipal boards, state assemblies and parliament. There has increasingly been a feeling that democracy ought to involve people more regularly and should not just mean casting a vote every 5 years. Both the concepts of participatory democracy and decentralized governance have thus become popular. Participatory democracy is a system of democracy in which the members of a group or community participate collectively in the taking of major decisions. This chapter will discuss the Panchayati Raj system as an example of a major initiative towards decentralized and grassroots democracy. Both the procedures as well as the values that inform Indian democracy have developed over the long years of India's anti-colonial struggle. In the last 60 years, since independence, the success of Indian democracy has been seen as a remarkable feat for a country with such great diversity as well as inequality. This chapter cannot possibly provide a comprehensive account of its rich and complex past and present. In this chapter we, therefore, try and provide only a synoptic view of democracy in India. We first look at the Indian Constitution, the bedrock of Indian democracy. We focus on its key values, briefly look at the making of the Constitution, drawing upon some snippets of the debates representing different views. Second, we look at the grassroots level of functioning democracy, namely the Panchayat Raj system. In both expositions you will notice that there are different groups of people representing competing interests and often also different political parties. This is an essential part of any functioning democracy. The third part of this chapter seeks to discuss how competing interests function, what the terms interest groups and political parties mean and what their role is in a democratic system such as ours. 3.1 The Indian Constitution. The core values of Indian democracy. Like so many other features of modern India, we need to begin the story about modern Indian democracy from the colonial period. You have just read about the many structural events that British colonialism brought about deliberately. Some of the changes that came about happened in an unintended fashion. The British did not intend to introduce them. For instance, they sought to introduce Western education to create a Western-educated Indian middle class that would help the colonial rulers to continue their rule. A Western-educated section of Indians did emerge. But, instead of aiding British rule, they used Western liberal ideas of democracy, social justice and nationalism to challenge colonial rule. This should not, however, suggest that democratic values and democratic institutions are purely Western. Our ancient epics, our diverse folk tales from one corner of the country to another are full of dialogues, discussions and contrasting positions. Think of any folk tale, riddles, folk song or any story from any epic that reveals different viewpoints. We just draw from one example from the epic Mahabharata. However, as we saw in Chapter 1 and 2, social change in modern India is not just about Indian or Western ideas. It is a combination as well as reinterpretation of Western and Indian ideas. We saw that in the case of the social reformers. We saw the use of both modern ideas of equality and traditional ideas of justice. Democracy is no exception. In colonial India, the undemocratic and discriminatory administrative practice of British colonialism contrasted sharply with the vision of freedom which Western theories of democracy espoused and which the Western-educated Indians read about. The scale of poverty and intensity of social discrimination within India also led to deeper questioning of the meaning of democracy. Is democracy just about political freedom? Or is it also about economic freedom and social justice? Is it also about equal rights to all irrespective of caste, creed, race and gender? And if that is so, how can such equality be realized in an unequal society? Many of these issues were thought of much before India became free. Even as India fought for its independence from British colonialism, a vision of what Indian democracy ought to look like emerged. As far back as in 1928, Motilal Nehru and 8 other Congress leaders drafted a constitution for India. In 1931, the resolution at the Karachi session of the Indian National Congress dwelt on how independent India's constitution should look like. The Karachi resolution reflects a vision of democracy that meant not just formal holding of elections but a substantive reworking of the Indian social structure in order to have a genuine democratic society. The Karachi resolution clearly spells out the vision of democracy that the nationalist movement in India had. It articulates the values that were further given full expression in the Indian Constitution. You will notice how the preamble of the Indian Constitution seeks to ensure not just political justice but also social and economic justice. You will likewise notice that equality is not just about equal political rights but also of status and opportunity. Democracy works at many levels. In this chapter we began with the vision of the Indian Constitution, for this is the bedrock upon which democracy rests in India. Significantly, the Constitution emerged from intense and open discussions within the Constituent Assembly. Thus, its vision or ideological content as well as the process or procedure by which it was formed was democratic. The next section briefly looks at some of the debates. Constituent Assembly debates, a history. In 1939, Gandhiji wrote an article in the Harijan, called The Only Way, in which he said, "The Constituent Assembly alone can produce a constitution indigenous to the country and truly and fully representing the will of the people, one based on unadulterated adult franchise for both men and women." The popular demand in 1939 for a constituent assembly was, after several ups and downs, conceded by imperialist Britain in 1945. In July 1946, the elections were held. In August 1946, the Indian National Congress's expert committee moved a resolution in the Constituent Assembly. This contained the declaration that India shall be a republic where the declared social, economic and political justice will be guaranteed to all the people of India. On matters of social justice, there were lively debates on whether government functions should be prescribed and the state should be bound down to them. Issues debated ranged from right to employment, to social security, land reforms to property rights, to the organization of panchayats. Here are some snippets from the debates. Competing interests, the constitution and social change. India exists at so many levels. The multireligious and multicultural composition of the population with distinct streams of tribal culture is one aspect of the plurality. Many divides classify the Indian people. The impact that culture, religion, and caste have on the urban-rural divide, rich-poor divide and the literate-illiterate divide is varied. Deeply stratified by caste and poverty, there are groupings and subgroupings among the rural poor. The urban working class comprises a very wide range. Then, there is the well-organized domestic business class, as also the professional and commercial class. The urban professional class is highly vocal. Competing interests operate on the Indian social scene and clamor for control of the state's resources. However, there are some basic objectives laid down in the Constitution and which are generally agreed in the Indian political world as being obviously just. These would be empowerment of the poor and marginalized, poverty alleviation, ending of caste and positive steps to treat all groups equally. Competing interests do not always reflect a clear class divide. Take the issue of the close down of a factory because it emits toxic waste and affects the health of those around. This is a matter of life, which the Constitution protects. The flip side is that the closure will render people jobless. Livelihood, again, is a matter of life that the Constitution protects. It is interesting that at the time of drawing up the Constitution, the Constituent Assembly was fully aware of this complexity and plurality but was intent on securing social justice as a guarantee. Constitutional norms and social justice, interpretation to aid social justice. It is useful to understand that there is a difference between law and justice. The essence of law is its force. Law is law because it carries the means to coerce or force obedience. The power of the state is behind it. The essence of justice is fairness. Any system of laws functions through a hierarchy of authorities. The basic norm from which all other rules and authorities flow is called the Constitution. It is the document that constitutes a nation's tenets. The Indian Constitution is India's basic norm. All other laws are made as per the procedures the Constitution prescribes. These laws are made and implemented by the authorities specified by the Constitution. A hierarchy of courts, which too are authorities created by the Constitution, interpret the laws when there is a dispute. The Supreme Court is the highest court and the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution. The Supreme Court has enhanced the substance of fundamental rights in the Constitution in many important ways. The box below illustrates a few instances. The Constitution is not just a ready referencer of dos and do nots for social justice. It has the potential for the meaning of social justice to be extended. Social movements have also aided the courts and authorities to interpret the contents of rights and principles in keeping with the contemporary understanding on social justice. Law and courts are sites where competing views are debated. The Constitution remains a means to channelize and civilize political power towards social welfare. You will realize that the Constitution has the capacity to help people because it is based on basic norms of social justice. For instance, the directive principle on village panchayats was moved as an amendment in the Constituent Assembly by K. Santhanam. After 40-odd years it became a constitutional imperative after the 73rd Amendment in 1992. You shall be dealing with this in the next section. 3.2 The Panchayati Raj and the Challenges of Rural Social Transformation. Ideals of Panchayati Raj. Panchayati Raj translates literally to governance by 5 individuals. The idea is to ensure at the village or grassroots level a functioning and vibrant democracy. While the idea of grassroots democracy is not an alien import to our country, in a society where there are sharp inequalities, democratic participation is hindered on grounds of gender, caste and class. Furthermore, as you shall see in the newspaper reports later in the chapter, traditionally there have been caste panchayats in villages. But they have usually represented dominant groups. Furthermore, they often held conservative views and often have, and continue to take decisions that go against both democratic norms and procedures. When the Constitution was being drafted, panchayats did not find a mention in it. At this juncture, a number of members expressed their sorrow, anger and disappointment over this issue. At the same time, drawing on his own rural experience, Dr. Ambedkar argued that local elites and upper castes were so well entrenched in society that local self-government only meant a continuing exploitation of the downtrodden masses of Indian society. The upper castes would no doubt silence this segment of the population further. The concept of local government was dear to Gandhiji too. He envisaged each village as a self-sufficient unit conducting its own affairs and saw Gram Swarajya to be an ideal model to be continued after independence. It was, however, only in 1992 that grassroots democracy or decentralized governance was ushered in by the 73 Road Constitutional Amendment. This act provided constitutional status to the Panchayati Raj institutions pre. It is compulsory now for local self-government bodies in rural and municipal areas to be elected every 5 years. More importantly, control of local resources is given to the elected local bodies. The 73 Road and 74 th amendments to the Constitution ensured the reservation of 1/3 of the total seats for women in all elected offices of local bodies in both the rural and urban areas. Out of this, 17% seats are reserved for women belonging to the scheduled castes and tribes. This amendment is significant as for the first time it brought women into elected bodies which also bestowed on them decision-making powers. 1/3 of the seats in local bodies, gram panchayats, village panchayats, municipalities, city corporations and district boards are reserved for women. The 1993 to 1994 elections, soon after the 73 Road Amendment brought in 800,000 women into the political processes in a single election. That was a big step indeed in enfranchising women. A constitutional amendment prescribed a three-tier system of local self-governance, red box 3.7 on the last page, for the entire country, effective since 1992 to 1993. Powers and responsibilities of panchayats. According to the Constitution, panchayats should be given powers and authority to function as institutions of self-government. It thus requires all state governments to revitalize local representative institutions. The following powers and responsibility were delegated to the panchayats: to prepare plans and schemes for economic development, to promote schemes that will enhance social justice, to levy, collect and appropriate taxes, duties, tolls and fees, help in the devolution of governmental responsibilities, especially that of finances, to local authorities. Social welfare responsibilities of the panchayats include the maintenance of burning and burial grounds, recording statistics of births and deaths, establishment of child welfare and maternity centers, control of cattle pounds, propagation of family planning and promotion of agricultural activities. The development activities include the construction of roads, public buildings, wells, tanks and schools. They also promote small cottage industries and take care of minor irrigation works. Many government schemes like the Integrated Rural Development Program, IRDP, and Integrated Child Development Scheme, ICDS, are monitored by members of the panchayat. The main income of the panchayats is from tax levied on property, profession, animals, vehicles, cess on land revenue and rentals. The resources are further increased by the grants received through the Zilla Panchayat. It is also considered compulsory for panchayat offices to put up boards outside their offices, listing the breakup of funds received, and utilization of the financial aid received. This exercise was taken up to ensure that people at the grassroots level should have the right to information, opening all functioning to the public eye. People had the right to scrutinize allocation of money and ask reasons for decisions that were taken for the welfare and development activities of the village. Nyaya panchayats have been constituted in some states. They possess the authority to hear some petty, civil and criminal cases. They can impose fines but cannot award a sentence. These village courts have often been successful in bringing about an agreement amongst contending parties. They have been particularly effective in punishing men who harass women for dowry and perpetrate violence against them. Many tribal areas have had a rich tradition of grassroots democratic functioning. We give an illustrative example from Meghalaya. All the three major ethnic tribal groups, namely, the Khasis, Jaintias and the Garos, have their own traditional political institutions that have existed for hundreds of years. These political institutions were fairly well developed and functioned at various tiers, such as the village level, clan level and state level. For instance, in the traditional political system of the Khasis, each clan had its own council known as the Durbar Khur, which was presided over by the clan headman. Though there is a long tradition of grassroots political institutions in Meghalaya, a large chunk of tribal areas lie outside the provisions of the 73 Road Amendment. This may be because the concerned policy makers did not wish to interfere with the traditional tribal institutions. However, as sociologist Tiplat Nongri remarks that tribal institutions in themselves need not necessarily be democratic in its structure and functioning. Commenting on the Buria Committee report that went into this issue, Nongri remarks that while the committee's concern for the traditional tribal institutions is appreciable, it fails to take stock of the complexity of the situation. For notwithstanding the strong egalitarian ethos that characterized tribal societies, the element of stratification is not altogether absent. Tribal political institutions are not only marked by open intolerance to women, but the process of social change has also introduced sharp distortions in the system, making it difficult to identify which is traditional and which is not. Nongri 2003, 220. This again brings you back to the changing nature of tradition that we discussed in Chapter 1 and 2. Democratization and inequality. It will be clear to you that democratization is not easy in a society that has had a long history of inequality based on caste, community and gender. You have dealt with the different kinds of inequality in the earlier book. In Chapter 4 you will get a fuller sense of rural Indian structure. Given this unequal and undemocratic social structure, it is not surprising that in many cases, certain members belonging to particular groups, communities, castes of the village are not included or informed about meetings and activities of the village. The Gram Sabha members are often controlled by a small coterie of rich landlords usually hailing from the upper castes or landed peasantry. They make decisions on development activities, allocate funds, leaving the silent majority as mere onlookers. The reports in the boxes below show different kind of experiences at the grassroots level. One shows how traditional panchayats are being used. Another reports on how the new institution of Panchayati Raj, in some cases, are truly bringing in radical changes. Yet another on how democratic measures do not often work out in practice because interest groups resist change in money matters. 3.3 Political parties, pressure groups in democratic politics. You will recall that this chapter began with the oft-quoted definition of democracy as a form of government that is of the people, by the people and for the people. As the chapter unfolded, you would have noticed how this definition captures the spirit of democracy but conceals the many divisions between one group of people and another. You have seen how interests and concerns are different. We have seen in Section 2 on the Indian Constitution how different groups sought to represent their interests within the Constituent Assembly. We also saw in the story of Indian democracy the contending interests of different groups. A look at the newspaper every morning will show you many instances where different groups seek to make their voices heard and draw the attention of the government to their grievances. The question, however, arises whether all interest groups are comparable. Can an illiterate peasant or literate worker make her case to the government as coherently and convincingly as an industrialist? Neither the industrialist nor the peasant or worker, however, represents their case as individuals. Industrialists form associations such as Federation of Indian Chambers and Commerce (FICCI) and Association of Chambers of Commerce (ASSOCHAM). Workers form trade unions such as the Indian Trade Union Congress, INTUC, or the Center for Indian Trade Unions, CITU. Farmers form agricultural unions such as Shetkari Sangathan. Agricultural laborers have their own unions. You will read about other kinds of organizations and social movements like tribal and environmental movements in the last chapter. In a democratic form of government, political parties are key actors. A political party may be defined as an organization oriented towards achieving legitimate control of government through an electoral process. Political party is an organization established with the aim of achieving governmental power and using that power to pursue a specific program. Political parties are based on certain understanding of society and how it ought to be. In a democratic system, the interests of different groups are also represented by political parties, who take up their case. Different interest groups will work towards influencing political parties. When certain groups feel that their interests are not being taken up, they may move to form an alternative party. Or they form pressure groups who lobby with the government. Interest groups are organized to pursue specific interests in the political arena, operating primarily by lobbying the members of legislative bodies. In some situations, there may be political organizations which seek to achieve power but are denied the opportunity to do so through standard means. These organizations are best regarded as movements until they achieve recognition. It is obvious that all groups will not have the same access or the same ability to pressurize the government. Some, therefore, argue that the concept of pressure groups underestimate the power that dominant social groups such as class or caste or gender have in society. They feel that it would be more accurate to suggest that dominant class or classes control the state. This does not negate the fact that social movements and pressure groups also continue to play a very important role in a democracy. Chapter 8 shows this. We illustrate how these contending interests function through the concrete example of developments in the city of Mumbai. Box 3.1. The tradition of questioning. when, in the Mahabharata, Bhrigu tells Bharadvaja that caste division relates to differences in physical attributes of different human beings, reflected in skin color, Bharadvaja responds not only by pointing to the considerable variations in skin color within every caste, if different colors indicate different castes, then all castes are mixed castes, but also by the more profound questions: we all seem to be affected by desire, anger, fear, sorrow, worry, hunger and labor. How do we have caste differences then? Box 3.2. Society has been aiming to lay a new foundation as was summarized by the French Revolution in 3 words: fraternity, liberty and equality. The French Revolution was welcomed because of this slogan. It failed to produce equality. We welcomed the Russian Revolution because it aims to produce equality. But it cannot be too much emphasized that in producing equality, society cannot afford to sacrifice fraternity or liberty. Equality will be of no value without fraternity or liberty. It seems that the 3 can coexist only if one follows the way of the Buddha. Ambedkar 1992. Box 3.3. Appendix number 6. What Swaraj will include. Karachi Congress Resolution, 1931. Swaraj is conceived by the Congress should include real economic freedom of the masses. The Congress declares that no constitution will be acceptable to it unless it provides or enables the Swaraj government to provide for 1. Freedom of expression, association and meeting. 2. Freedom of religion. 3. Protection of all cultures and languages. 4. All citizens shall be equal before the law. 5. No disability in employment or trade or profession on account of religion, caste or sex. 6. Equal rights and duties for all in regard to public wells, schools, etc. 7. All to have right to bear arms in accordance with regulations. 8. No person to be deprived of property or liberty except in accordance with law. 9. Religious neutrality of state. 10. Adult suffrage. 11. Free compulsory primary education. 12. No titles to be conferred. 13. Capital punishment to be abolished. 14. Freedom of movement for every citizen of India and right to settle and acquire property in any part thereof, and equal protection of law. 15. Proper standard of life for industrial workers and suitable machinery for settlement of disputes between employers and workers and protection against old age, sickness, etc. 16. All labor to be free from conditions of serfdom. 17. Special protection of women workers. 18. Children not to be employed in mines and factories. 19. Rights of peasants and workers to form unions. 20. Reform of system of land revenue and tenure and rent, exempting rent and revenue for uneconomical holdings and reduction of dues payable for smaller holdings. 21. Inheritance tax on graduated scale. 22. Reduction of military expenditure by at least half. 23. No servant of state ordinarily to be paid above 500 rupees per month. 24. Abolition of salt tax. 25. Protection of indigenous cloth against competition of foreign cloth. 26. Total prohibition of intoxicating drinks and drugs. 27. Currency and exchange in national interest. 28. Nationalization of key industries and services, railways, etc. 29. Relief of agricultural indebtedness and control of usury. 30. Military training for citizens. Karachi Resolution condensed to be printed on membership forms. Box 3.4. Preamble. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign socialist secular democratic republic, and to secure to all its citizen justice, social, economic and political liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation, in our Constituent Assembly this 26th day of November, 1949, do hereby adopt, enact and give to ourselves this Constitution. Box 3.5. Snippets from the debates. KT. Shaw said that the right to useful employment could and should be made real by a categoric obligation on the part of the state to provide useful work to every citizen who was able and qualified. B. Doss spoke against classifying the functions of the government as justiciable and non-justiciable. I think it is the primary duty of government to remove hunger and render social justice to every citizen and to secure social security. The teeming millions do not find any hope that the Union Constitution will ensure them freedom from hunger, will secure them social justice, will ensure them a minimum standard of living and a minimum standard of public health. Ambedkar's answer was as follows: the draft constitution as framed only provides a machinery for the government of the country. It is not a contrivance to install any particular party in power as has been done in some countries. Who should be in power is left to be determined by the people, as it must be, if the system is to satisfy the tests of democracy. But whoever captures power will not be free to do what he likes with it. In the exercise of it, he will have to respect these instruments of instructions which are called directive principles. He cannot ignore them. He may not have to answer for their breach in a court of law. But he will certainly have to answer for them before the electorate at election time. What great value these directive principles possess will be realized better when the forces of right contrive to capture power. On land reform, Nehru said that the social forces were such that law could not stand in the way of reform, an interesting reflection on the dynamics between the two. If law and parliaments do not fit themselves into the changing picture, they cannot control the situation. On the protection of the tribal people and their interests, leaders like Jaipal Singh were assured by Nehru in the following words during the Constituent Assembly debates: "It is our intention and our fixed desire to help them as possible, in as efficient a way as possible, to protect them from possibly their rapacious neighbors occasionally and to make them advance." Even as the Constituent Assembly adopted the titled Directive Principles of State Policy to the rights that courts could not enforce, additional principles were added with unanimous acceptance. These included K. Santhanam's clause that the state shall organize village panchayats and endow them with the powers and authority to be effective units of local self-government. T. A. Ramalingam Chettiar added the clause for promotion of cottage industries on cooperative lines in rural areas. Veteran parliamentarian Thakurdas Bhargava added that the state should organize agriculture and animal husbandry on modern lines. Box 3.6. A fundamental right includes all that is incidental to it. The terse words of Article 21 recognizing the right to life and liberty have been interpreted as including all that goes into a life of quality, including livelihood, health, shelter, education and dignity. In various pronouncements, different attributes of life have been expanded and life has been explained to mean more than mere animal existence. These interpretations have been used to provide relief to prisoners subjected to torture and deprivation, release and rehabilitation of bonded laborers, against environmentally degrading activities, to provide primary health care and primary education. In 1993, the Supreme Court held that right to information is part of and incidental to the right to expression under Article 19(1) a. Reading directive principles into the content of fundamental rights. The Supreme Court read the directive principle of equal pay for equal work into the fundamental right to equality under Article 14 and has provided relief to many plantation and agricultural laborers and to others. Box 3.7. The three-tier system of Panchayati Raj institution. The structure is like a pyramid. At the base of the structure stands the unit of democracy or Gram Sabha. This consists of the entire body of citizens in a village or grama. It is this general body that elects the local government and charges it with specific responsibilities. The Gram Sabhas ideally ought to provide an open forum for discussions and village-level development activities and play a crucial role in ensuring inclusion of the weaker sections in the decision-making processes. The 73rd Amendment provided a three-tier system of Panchayati Raj for all states having a population of over 20 lakhs. It became mandatory that election to these bodies be conducted every 5 years. It provided reservation of seats for the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes and 33% seats for women. It constituted district planning committee to prepare drafts and develop plans for the district as a whole. Panchayati Raj in tribal areas. Box 3.8. Kalavati, a Dalit by caste, was apprehensive about standing for elections. She is Panchayat member and realizes that her confidence and self-esteem has grown ever since she became a member of the Panchayat. Most importantly, she has a name. Before she became a member of the Panchayat, she was only called as Ramesh mother, or Harilal's wife. If she lost the election for the post of the Pradhan, she felt Sakyan ki nak kat jay, her friends would lose face. Box 3.9. Ban Panchayats. In Uttarakhand, women do most of the work since the men are often posted far away in the defense services. Most of the villagers are still dependent on firewood for cooking. As you may know, deforestation is a big problem in the mountainous regions. Women sometimes walk many miles to collect firewood and fodder for their animals. To overcome this problem, women have set up Van Panchayats. Members of the Van Panchayats develop nurseries and nurture tree saplings for planting on the hill slopes. Members also police nearby forests to keep an eye on illegal felling of trees. The Chipko movement, where women hugged trees to prevent them from being cut, had its beginnings in this area. Box 3.10. Panchayati Raj training for illiterate women. Innovative modes of communicating the strength of the Panchayat Raj system. The story of two villages, Sukhipur and Dukipur, are unraveled through a cloth PHAD, or a scroll, a traditional folk medium of storytelling. Village Dukipur, sad village, has a corrupt Pradhan, Bimla, who has spent the money received from the Panchayat for building a school, on constructing a house for herself and her family. The rest of the village are sad and poor. On the other hand, Sukhipur, happy village, has a content populace as the Pradhan, Najma, has invested rural reconstruction money in developing good infrastructure for her village. Here the primary health center is functioning, it has a puka building and also has a good road so that buses can reach the village. Pictorial pictures on the PHAD, accompanied with folk music, were useful tools to convey the message for able governance and participation. This innovative method of storytelling was very effective in bringing awareness to unlettered women. Most importantly, the campaign conveyed the message that it was not enough to merely vote, or to stand for election, or to win. But important to know why one is voting for a particular person, what are the traits to look for, and what does he or she stand for. The value for integrity is also emphasized through the story and song media of the PHAD. Box 3.11. Bound by honor. Caste panchayats are reasserting themselves as guardians of village morality. The first case that hit the headlines was in October 2004, when the Radi Kap Panchayat in Asanda village of Jajjar district ordered Sonia, who had already been married a year by then, to dissolve her marriage with Rampal, abort her unborn child and accept her husband as a brother if she wanted to stay in the village. The couple's fault, sharing the same gotri even though the Hindu Marriage Act recognizes such unions. Sonia and Rampal could live together again only after the High Court directed the Haryana government to provide them security. One such Jati Panchayat of Ansaris in Muzaffarnagar decided in June last year that Imran's rape by her father-in-law had made her a mother to her husband. Another in a Meerut village ruled that Gudiya, pregnant with the child of her second husband, should return to her first, who had reappeared after 5 years. Box 3.12. Role of wealth and privilege. Role of villagers. This time around, Sumpa Sarpanch seat fell within the quota reserved for women. Nevertheless, Panchayat residents considered this as a contest between the candidates' husbands and a face-off among equals. On one hand was the incumbent Sarpanch, Ram Raimwada, who owns a liquor shop in Kekri, and on the other Chand Singh Thakur, a rich landowner from the same village. Interestingly, Mwada had been exposed by the village residents for faking muster rolls in the drought relief works during 2002 to 2003. Although no action was taken against him, the villagers were determined to see him out of office this time and thus put up the Thakur for a stiff competition. The residents of Suma unanimously decided that the Thakur was best suited to oppose Mwada. Box 3.13. Role of social movements and organizations for greater participation and information. One such meeting took place on January 24 in Darela village, Kushalpura Panchayat. The meeting was publicized by going from door to door and through announcements by gathering children, teaching them slogans where a worker from a very well-reputed NGO led them around the village as they urged people to come to the chapel for the meeting. Tara's, the local NGO-supported candidate, Ghoshana Patra, manifesto, was read out and she made a short speech. Her Ghoshana Patra included not just taking of bribes as sarpanch, not spending more than Rs. 2,000 on campaigning, etc. Distribution of alcohol and gur, and the use of jeeps are frequently used means of buying votes and contribute to campaign expenditure. The entire chain of corruption is explained to the gathered villagers. Low-cost elections not only allow the poor to participate, they also make corruption-free panchayats possibility. Box 3.14. Every year at the tail end of February, the Finance Minister of the Government of India presents the budget to the Parliament. Prior to this, there are reports every day in the newspaper of the meetings that the various Confederation of Indian Industrialists, of trade unions, farmers, and more recently women's groups had with the Ministry of Finance. Box 3.15. Max Weber on parties. Whereas the genuine place of classes is within the economic order, the place of status groups is within the social order, but parties live in a house of power. Party actions are always directed towards a goal which is striven for in a planned manner. The goal may be a cause, the party may aim at realizing a program for ideal or material purposes, or the goal may be personal, sinecures,